A Thousand Years of Scars, Tracing the Violent Histories of Mass Housing Mounds. Some of you who saw the very early 5-minute pitch of this in February might remember this title. The paper I submitted, I don't know how many of you've read it, provides a more detailed elaboration on the first third of this presentation to give you an understanding of the resolution to which I stretch some of these deeper historical perspectives. And here I will try to provide a more comprehensive overview to contextualize the written piece within the broader chapter context. So mass housing estates in Berlin, they're currently experiencing a significant re-evaluation of their capacities to address interrelated challenges such as resurfacing housing crisis, global warming, and social pluralization in Berlin, but also elsewhere. But although recent architectural historiography has increasingly focused on these grands ensembles of modernism, it has so far failed to account for the deeper histories embedded in the marshy land beneath and around the neighborhoods. The case of Berlin, of course, provides two relatively unique spheres to study the role of land in housing estates with two fundamentally different political systems that faced each other. More than 1/5 of Berliners live in housing estates today, while they actually only cover 5% of the city's surface. Märkisches Viertel and Marzahn, my focus neighborhoods within the 50 housing estates of Berlin, were built within roughly 1 decade each. I'm not sure if you can read these stats from the back, but they mainly just symbolize that they're quite dense, that there are a lot of people living on a relatively small area, and they're still pretty green. And so within these case studies, I focus on artificial lakes and mounds that emerged as companion landscape features during their construction. And for today, I want to highlight these two. You see on the right, Marzahn's Kienberg, former East Berlin, measuring about 100 meters in height and sits on the eastern edge of the housing estate embedded in a river valley. And we have Lübars Höhe in Märkisches Viertel on the left, in former West Berlin, which is of similar proportions and located on the northeastern side of the housing estate, right along the former Berlin Wall course. So the wall would be over here, and this is where the mound is located in relation to the housing estate. And adding a few quick words about methodology, I'm currently trying to develop this land-oriented research approach to comparatively explore the housing estates from the ground up that I call AGE, an acronym for 3 interfering temporalities. And now this is the part that I just had to reconstruct before my presentation. I hope it works. So the first part is assembling, which really operates on a geoclimatic temporality of land formation, so something that has recently been more known as deep time or longue durée. Governing, a medium-length period of macro-political governance and transformation, usually more often applied in architectural history when talking about these mass housing estates. And lastly, enmeshing, a very short-lived timescale of events and spatial appropriation starting in the 1970s, something that I won't talk that much about today. So today, actually, I'm trying to stick to the step of assembling the perspective of long-term terrain transformation and the origin of detritus materials and the epistemologies enabling these mounds to exist in the first place. So as represented on this woodcut, Berlin roughly emerged in the 1100s as a twin city from a swamp in a very, comparatively low-lying glacial valley characterized by wetland vegetation. This is also reflected in its name, Berl, meaning swamp, in the extinct West Slavic language Polabian. The marshy origins of this place are also very evident in its soil compositions and the city's abundance of smaller watercourses all over the city. And around 13,700 BCE, the melting waters of Scandinavian ice masses carved a sandy valley highlighted in green, stretching from Warsaw to Berlin. The valley was incredibly swampy, as I said, and difficult to cross, so merchants settled here in the 12th century on two sides of the River Spree, on the shortest distance between the two drier plateaus on a north-south trade route. And so the river was fed by numerous tributaries from the northern and southern glacial plateaus, highlighted in shades of ochre, of which the northern is the one on which the two housing estates are situated today. So they were supposed to show in red, but now they show in white, so they're here and here. And this is Berlin's current administrative boundary. So I typically show this map because the impermeable clay of the plateau would have very comparable consequences for the construction and design of both sides of the wall, and to underline that soil, of course, never cared about artificial political divisions, but in this instance, I want to use it to highlight how the clay's anaerobic nature also helped to preserve the remains of early Bronze Age societies, which the housing construction teams uncovered during the unprecedented removal of soil and resculpting of the land surface during the mass housing construction. So the enormous construction site of West Berlin's Märkisches Viertel, for example, enabled a quite rich exploration of archaeological findings, as found in this exhibition catalog from 1972, based on the fieldwork of 4 young student archaeologists. And in it, they highlight prehistoric settlement discoveries made during the construction of the housing estate between 68 and 72 on the remains of a glacial era shifting dune called Gottesberg. However, these findings never left the realm of scientific inquiry and remain as a single issue in the local district archive, and found also no entryway into mainstream literature on Berlin's archaeology, which is relatively curious because they were quite knowledge producing for the time. And among the discoveries in East Berlin, archaeologists also found traces of a millennium-old Germanic well, and this well was built on the foundations of a Slavic well, proving the Slavic heritage of the land under today's Berlin. In contrast to the West, East Berlin really utilized these findings to construct a strong ideological connection to the housing estate. As East Berlin was in the power sphere of the Soviet Union, of course, these discoveries really helped establish a narrative that these lands were historically Slavic and inhabited by working-class families without private property since the Bronze Age, about 5,000 years ago, until Albert the Bear, an Ascanian margrave of the Holy Roman Empire of German nations, violently attacked, killed, and displaced most of these tribes in the 12th century, establishing the first military framework and introducing a patriarchal system along with feudal land ownership. And so this medieval German eastward expansion of German territories on previously Slavic lands led to the establishment of these medieval villages of Marzahn and Lübars in the early 13th century to control the land through agricultural cultivation. And both Berlins later constructed the housing estates very much in relation to these villages as extensions of the park landscapes between the concrete towers and slabs, and as contrasting cultural landscapes to experience a narrative of progress firsthand. So you can see that a little bit over here. This is pretty much how East German planners like to frame the Plattenbau, the mass housing estate, in contrast to how humans used to live. So there's a quite direct connection between this medieval warfare and the rendering of this housing estate. And then in 1415, the nearby twin city Berlin-Köln, on the shores of the River Spree, so at the time these villages weren't part of Berlin, so the nearby twin city Berlin-Köln on the shores of the River Spree, which by the way was named after the Slavic Spreewaner tribe, began its long trajectory to the center of power for the future Prussian Empire. The Holy Roman Emperor appointed a member of a dynasty that would later become rulers of Prussia after the 30 Years' War, shifting the center of its political power to Berlin. And while Frederick I turned the village of Marzahn into a Vorwerk, a military outpost, the land of Lübars near Märkisches Viertel found itself amidst Prussian history when his son Frederick II established this royal pheasantry for his wife in 1740. So the view on the right is in fact from the freshly covered landfill Mount Lübzer Höhe in 1985. And the pheasantry today functions as a youth and family farm at the foot of the mount, heavily used by the residents of this housing estate. But actually, Prussian history particularly intersects with the housing estates through the internal colonization strategy of the Prussian Settlement Commission, which drove the continued expansion of Germans on Slavic land. So, mirroring Prussia's broader global expansion tactics, the Commission expanded the myth of a wild East needing to be conquered and tamed. So this conquest involved displacing Polish landowners and resettling ethnic Germans on Polish land, adopting and also racializing Ebenezer Howard's British Garden City movement to showcase German superiority with Berlin as a central building block in that scheme. And as you can see in the quotes, the urban planner became really an agent in the struggle against Polishness, intertwined with the expansion of German land as property. And so after the Holy Roman and then the Prussian, then Hitler's Third Reich, of course, perpetuated these ideas of Lebensraum for the German people, increasing and taxonomizing the degradation of minorities to a racially inferior position. This discrimination very much reverberates in the landscapes of Marzahn and Märkisches Viertel, as both sides had seen the establishment of concentration camps before their construction. Marzahn, as seen here on the slide, incorporated a concentration camp for Romani people, most of whom were later deported to Auschwitz. Near the site of West Berlin's rubble mound, Nazis located a camp for forced workers of Slavic origin. And both the detritus of the camp and especially the war structures built by the prisoners' labor, such as bunkers, co-created the first layer of each mound. And then after the Greater Berlin Act in 1920, the incorporation of its surrounding medieval villages and the city's industrializing periphery, the village's farmers had begun to lease their land to allotment dwellers. So when formerly East Prussian settlers returned to Berlin as internal migrants, these dwelling communities grew significantly. And then the Nazis' defeat and dissolution of East Prussia caused additional migration, contributing further to the growth of this periphery. And so displaced from originally Polish land, the German Farmer Settlement Company facilitated this sort of movement, which actually merged in 1972 with the successor of the Prussian Society for the Promotion of Internal Colonization. So this sort of process of Prussian internal colonization formally really lived through these institutes well into the 1970s. And so the emergence of these allotment dwellings typically marks the beginning of mass housing estates and urban studies, often concentrating on the more commonly known violence of modern urbanism and 1960s urban renewal, where many of the dwellers were evicted, leading to suicides and material losses. Much of the demolished remnants formed the very first layer of the rubble and waste mounds dumped along with war rubble of the inner city and other types of rubble, such as the concentration camps. Some of this early building material, as we've already learned from Sonia in her presentation, can still be found when walking up these mounds today, like bricks or ceramic. And so to build up towards my conclusion, the design idea for these mounds drew from Reinhold Lingner's 1946 landscape master plan for Berlin, who envisioned a biomorphic linear city using war rubble mounds to emphasize glacial plateau edges, as seen on this map that I showed you in the beginning, where Lingner really drew from his military expertise during the World Wars to try to conceal these war remnants. So I think there's also in this sort of presence and absence, there's also some kind of engineering, a notion of engineering these kinds of absences and engineering the process of forgetting. And then Linge's strategy of using the landscape's topographic character to seamlessly integrate the removal of war debris became a quite central strategy of, for example, Marzahns landscape architect Hans-Georg Büchner, when East Berlin established a new rubble landfill for excavated soil, war rubble, and demolition debris on a former Soviet military training ground in the 1960s. And so this period marks the beginning of my two case study mounts in both East and West Berlin. This is where I would sort of pick up on the next sort of temporality on governing and how then both governments really actively shaped these terrains. But for now, I will conclude and just say that pondering what the Mound's soil remembers materializes the beginnings of German war crimes and the dispossession of Slavic people, today hidden under sort of these public parks providing peaceful views over a city very much on the verge of forgetting when we look at the current election results in especially Eastern Germany. These immense infrastructural projects were not only enabled by technological advancements of a post-war construction industry, but also by a centuries-old geopolitical project to make resisting land compliant and inhabitable. By foregrounding this memory, I want to reframe Berlin's mass housing estates not just as flat products of architectural modernism, but as palimpsests of contested territory and erased lives. And so their very construction, preceded by the excavation and removal of soil, unveiled an ancient tension in the land's heritage. And so the idea of taming the wilderness originated in the medieval conquests over the people originally inhabiting marshy protective forests to counter Roman imperial expansion, and later translated via Prussian internal colonization to 20th century Nazi crimes and planning instruments of displacement. And so I will conclude by arguing that post-war Germany's large settlements, Großsiedlungen, and the ambitions of modernist designers were very much rooted in the architectural toolset of imperial internal colonization techniques to shape populations and territories, rather than magically rising from the ruins of a fallen empire as the East German national anthem had it. Thank you.